This is a Viking. Oh, no, sorry, not that guy. That guy. According to history, the Viking Age lasted from the year 793 to 1066. That's a very specific 273 years in which raiders would arrive in their advanced ships, decimate a rival nation's coastline, and sail off home. This normal-looking picture of a normal-looking man next to a definitive end date for the Viking Age begs the question, what happened to them? Did they all just die? No. If you believe this, then you have been lied to. Because the Vikings never actually died out. They walk among us today, hidden in plain sight and ready to mount a revolution to take over the world. Except for that last bit. Everyone knows the stories. Europe was in the Dark Ages. The church had led and controlled societies, most of which were small city-states. Most people were poor, but regional leaders and church-owned abbeys and cathedrals held riches beyond the wildest dreams of a person from that era. Despite the hardships, life continued and civilians were happy, apart from all the disease, malnutrition, power imbalance, slave labor, financial oppression, murders, criminality, local wars, and the generally out of proportion likelihood of an early death. But there was a problem, one of which would ominously emerge out of the unknown. The hatred and bitter quarreling between the small states meant they didn't cooperate. And for some reason, nobody had thought to invest in a navy to protect them from attacks from the sea. Into this open goal wandered the Viking raiders, appearing on the horizon in their far more advanced longboats. Covered in war paint and absolutely not ever at all wearing horned helmets, they would beach their vessels, raid, murder, steal, and capture everything and everyone they could, especially the monks who couldn't and wouldn't fight back, then return to their homelands. But a Viking isn't actually a race at all. The people from modern-day Scandinavia were called Northmen or Norsemen because they were from a county in the south. In their language, Old Norse, Vikinger meant what we today would translate as pirate or raider. And so, being a Viking was much more of a profession than a type of people. The job of being a Viking is what died out, becoming obsolete thanks to changes in the geographical and political landscapes. Yet, the end of the Viking Age would have been a lonely time to be a bloodthirsty murderer, but it was a great time to be a rich, Christian, aristocratic farm estate owner. More on that later. In other words, all Vikings were Scandinavian men from the north, but not all Northmen were Vikings. In fact, the vast majority weren't. It's actually like saying all the first cowboys were American, but not all Americans were cowboys. In modern English, the word Viking has become synonymous with an inhabitant of the Scandinavian region or someone descended from there. But technically, this is a corruption of what being a Viking really meant in olden times. They may not have flown the Jolly Roger or questioned the continual absence of rum. Still, the real Vikings had more in common with Jack Sparrow than we might imagine. And the thing is, the job of being a Viking, well, like top hats and that sweater your grandmother knitted, raiding just became quite unfashionable. They were much riskier and didn't yield the previously guaranteed enormous payouts seized from murdered defenseless monks. The Vikings noticed the people who had once been their prey making a few changes to their defenses. For example, some monks living in abbeys on Britain's shores decided, hey, let's just move house. So they did, dismantling their holy home brick by brick and putting it back together a few miles inland. The next time the Vikings turned up, they stood confused and dumbfounded, defeated not by superior armed forces, but by a mediocre real estate agent. These small powers became much stronger. In fact, Alfred the Great used the threat of Vikings to unite England into one country under his rule, vastly improving their defense capacity. Leaders like him invested heavily in defenses and alliances to protect themselves against the Vikings. The most important development was that of ships and organized state navies that could withstand the Viking shock raids. Suddenly, the Vikings had to turn tail and flee when they embarked on a raid instead of the other way around. The final nail in the Vikings' pirate coffin was that, apart from a small few, most Scandinavian people weren't really interested. Rather than simply being bloodthirsty, rampaging psychopaths, most Vikings saw their raids as a way to raise capital for business investments, or to find land suitable for inhabiting and farming. Being a Viking was a dying occupation because nobody wanted to do it. Perhaps they'd relate strongly to call center operators or colonoscopy technicians. Anyway, once the last great Viking battle had been fought at Stamford Bridge in 1066 and lost, the raiders became farmers. They lived peaceful, happy lives, dancing to musicals and skipping arm in arm down the street. And the Viking Age came to an end. And the reason you don't hear much about this period at the end of the Viking Age is, well, it's not very interesting. So I'll stop talking about it. But, I hear you say, my friend Bob is directly descended from the Vikings, and I know because he did one of those spitty DNA test thingies, and now he won't shut up about it. Well, dear viewer, your friend Bob is right. Technically, depending on who you ask, his DNA profile may indicate that he hails from the Scandinavian region, including Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, or perhaps his little chart shows places like Orkney, the Faroe Islands, parts of Britain and Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, Western Russia, or Ukraine. These were all areas where Vikings settled. As explained earlier in our modern English, we've mixed the meanings of Vikings and person from Scandinavia. You can tell Bob he's a Viking if it makes him feel better, but there we go again. If we want to be technically and grammatically accurate, and who doesn't want that, the Vikings were the raiders, the pirates. Most civilians and leaders from their homelands were just people, normal, just like you, maybe. And people don't just vanish and cease to exist unless you're watching some ridiculous movie. They change. They learn the local cultures and take on the local cuisine. Within a few centuries, they're indistinguishable from their neighbors. One of the main plot twists here was the sweeping adoption of forms of Christianity in regional governments around the year 1000. This quickly replaced their old belief system, which was centered around Odin, Valhalla, and drinking yourself to death without dying. It's thought that the Scandinavian leadership accepted Christianity to cement trade relationships with other countries, most of which were already Christian, and to consolidate power and order in their own countries. However, the cost they had to pay was allowing the Roman Church a much more prominent and influential place within their governments. Naturally, the Church condemned outright slaughter, and with the national leaders having converted to Christianity, they had no choice but to submit to the Pope's overriding authority. And so the Northmen, the ethnic group to which Vikings belonged, still exist today. Perhaps you're one of them, but their economy is no longer propped up by state-sponsored sea raids or by sending psychopaths to murder monks and burn down their abbeys, and thus the Viking Age is well and truly over. As far as we know, no, I'm just joking. And so, if there's any lesson to be learned here, it's that boats are cool, but only if you have the best boat of them all. Anyways, bye!